My name is Carrie Kiger. I'm 32 years old, and if you had asked me, not long ago, what stability felt like, I would have pointed to the quiet routines of our shared life. The way the coffee maker hummed at the same hour every morning, the shoes lined up by the door, the unspoken agreement that Sundays were for groceries and bad reality TV. Stability wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there, dependable, like a hand resting on your back. I'd been with my boyfriend Mark for almost 2 years. He was 29 when we met at a friend's backyard barbecue, one of those gatherings where you're handed a paper plate and a warm drink and somehow end up talking for hours as if the noise around you doesn't exist. We clicked immediately. It wasn't fireworks, it was alignment. Easy laughter, shared values, a sense that we were walking at the same pace without trying. 8 months later, we moved in together. People warned us about rushing. We didn't listen. It felt right, and for a long time it was. Mark was smart, charming without trying, and ambitious in a way that didn't feel performative. He talked about the future like it was a place he intended to arrive at, not a fantasy he liked to visit. Marriage came up naturally. Kids too, the whole shape of a life. I remember thinking, this is what choosing well looks like. But there was always a wall. It wasn't obvious at first. More like a pattern you only recognize once it repeats often enough to form a shape. The first time I asked about his past, it felt casual. We were washing dishes, standing shoulder to shoulder, the kitchen window fogged with steam. "So," I said lightly, "what was your ex-girlfriend like?" He didn't look up from the plate he was scrubbing. "I don't want to talk about it. Just drop it." No explanation, no follow-up. Just that phrase, "drop it," said gently, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. I did. Everyone has things they'd rather not revisit. I told myself that respect meant not prying. The second time was a few weeks later. We were looking through an old box of photos he'd brought from storage. College years, early jobs, a couple of group shots where I didn't recognize anyone. "How come you never mentioned college friends?" I asked. "You were there 4 years, right?" "That's ancient history," he said, closing the box a little too quickly. "Can we drop it?" Again I did. The third time should have registered as more than coincidence. We were lying in bed, the room dark, except for the glow of his phone. A notification popped up. Someone had tagged him in a photo from years ago. I caught a glimpse before he swiped it away. A woman's name in the caption. Chris, short for Christina. "Who's that?" I asked. He went still. "Nobody important." I waited. He didn't elaborate. "Can you please just drop it?" he added, his tone polite but firm. I dropped it. At first, I framed it as boundaries. Healthy adults have them. Trauma, bad breakups, family drama. No one owes you their entire history on demand. I told myself he'd open up when he was ready. But it kept happening. Every question that drifted backward in time hit the same invisible barrier. "Why did you move to this city?" Drop it. "Why are you estranged from your older sister?" I don't want to talk about that. "What was your last job like?" That part of my life is over. Anything before 2021 was treated like a locked room in a house we supposedly shared. 18 months in, the wall felt less like a boundary and more like a blindfold. We were talking seriously about getting engaged, about merging finances, about where we'd live long term. And I realized something unsettling. I knew how he took his coffee, how he liked his shirts folded, how he reacted when he was stressed, but I didn't know who he had been. Not really. One night I finally said it out loud. We were sitting at this dining table, paperwork spread between us, wedding venues, rough budgets, timelines sketched in pen. The future laid out neatly, like it could be assembled with enough planning. "Mark," I said, choosing my words carefully, "we're talking about marriage. I need to understand who I'm building this life with." He leaned back in his chair, already defensive. "What does that mean?" "It means I can't marry someone whose entire past is off limits," I said. "Everyone has a past. I'm not asking for every detail, I just need context." "My past doesn't define me," he said quickly. "Why can't you just love who I am now?" "I do love who you are now," I replied, "but who you are now didn't appear out of nowhere." His jaw tightened. "Well, mine is none of your business." The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. "Either accept that," he continued, "or don't." I sat there, looking at him, really looking, at the way his eyes flicked away from mine, at how practiced the line sounded, as if he'd said it before. Something inside me went quiet, not peacefully, but in that hollow way that follows a sudden drop. "Okay," I said finally, my voice calm. "I'll drop it." Relief washed over his face. He smiled, reached for my hand. Thank you. I knew you'd understand. I didn't understand, but I stopped asking. What I didn't stop doing was thinking. The next morning, while Mark was at work, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I told myself I was being practical, not suspicious, that when you're planning a shared future, you verify things. Background checks weren't just for strangers, they were for clarity. I found a professional service, comprehensive package, public records only. The price tag made me hesitate, $425, but something steadied in me as I clicked confirm. It felt less like betrayal and more like insurance. When Mark came home that evening, he kissed my cheek and asked what was for dinner. I smiled and answered like everything was normal. Inside, a quiet countdown had begun. I didn't know then what I would find. I didn't know how many versions of him existed on paper. I only knew that the man who kept telling me to drop it had made one thing very clear. If I wanted the truth, I wasn't going to get it from him. So I went looking. I told him I'd drop it. And on the surface, I did. I stopped asking questions that pointed backward. I didn't bring up old photos or unfamiliar names. I didn't probe when conversations drifted too close to years I apparently wasn't allowed to know. I learned how to steer around the silence the way you learn to avoid a loose floorboard, without acknowledging it exists. Mark noticed the change almost immediately. He seemed lighter, more affectionate, like a man relieved of a long-held tension he hadn't realized was weighing him down. He wrapped his arms around me from behind while I cooked. He talked more about the future, trips we'd take, neighborhoods we might move to, the kind of wedding that would suit us. Small, he said. Intimate. Just people who mattered. I smiled. I nodded. I played my part. But inside, something had shifted. When you stop asking questions, you don't stop thinking. You just redirect the energy. Instead of curiosity, it becomes observation. Instead of dialogue, pattern recognition. I started noticing the details I'd previously brushed past. The way Mark's phone never left his side, not in the shower, not on the nightstand, not face up on the coffee table. Always face down, always within reach. The way he went still, not dramatically, but subtly, whenever conversations drifted toward his previous marriage. The way he referred to that part of his life as complicated, then immediately changed the subject, as if even naming it crossed a line. I noticed how carefully curated his stories were, how every anecdote he told began somewhere in the middle, with no beginning and no aftermath. Like a book with its first and last chapters torn out. We were living together, sleeping in the same bed, planning a life that required trust at its foundation. And yet, there were entire rooms in his history I wasn't allowed to enter. One night, a week after our conversation, we went out to dinner with another couple, friends of his. I didn't know well, but who'd known him long before I came into the picture. Over wine and shared plates, they reminisced about the past. Old apartments, bad jobs, a marriage that ended badly. No one said her name out loud, but I caught it once, slipped into conversation and quickly passed over. Laura. Mark's jaw tightened for half a second. Then he laughed and redirected the conversation smoothly, like a host changing topics before anyone noticed the tension. No one called him on it, but I noticed. On the drive home, I waited, let the silence stretch, gave him space to fill it if he wanted. He didn't. You were quiet tonight, he said finally. Just tired, I replied. It wasn't a lie. I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix. At home, he kissed me goodnight and fell asleep quickly, breathing deep and even beside me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of a life that suddenly felt staged. That was when I understood something important. Mark wasn't just avoiding his past. He was actively protecting it. And people don't protect nothing. They protect things that can hurt them or expose them. The next morning, after he left for work, I didn't hesitate. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open, sunlight pooling across the surface like it was any other ordinary day. I told myself I wasn't doing this to him. I was doing it for me, for clarity, for safety, for the version of myself who was considering legally binding her life to someone else's. The background check service was efficient, almost disturbingly so. Options laid out cleanly. Basic, standard, comprehensive. I selected the most thorough one without overthinking it. Public records only. Legal. Transparent. The confirmation email arrived seconds after I submitted payment. Estimated turnaround, 5 to 7 business days. I closed my laptop and went about my day like nothing had happened. That week stretched in strange ways. Time moved forward, but my attention felt split. One part of me present, the other waiting. Every interaction with Mark felt slightly off, like watching a scene you already knew would end badly. He was sweet, thoughtful, attentive. If anything, he seemed more himself than ever. And that scared me, because if there was something dark underneath, it meant he could compartmentalize with terrifying efficiency. On the third day, my phone buzzed while I was at work, an email notification. Your report is ready. I didn't open it right away. I waited until I got home, until I was alone, until the door was locked and the apartment was quiet. I made tea I didn't drink, sat on the couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, my heart beating too fast for no obvious reason. 38 pages. That was the first thing I noticed. 38 pages about a man I lived with, loved, planned to marry. And as I stared at the screen, one thought cut through everything else. Whatever he worked this hard to hide was never going to stay buried. I didn't sleep that night. Mark lay beside me, breathing slow and even, one arm flung over the edge of the bed like he had nothing in the world to worry about. I stared at the ceiling until the dark began to thin into early morning gray, replaying the same thought on a loop. What kind of life requires this much silence to survive? By morning, my body felt hollowed out, like the shock had burned through everything soft and left only structure behind. I moved through the next few days on autopilot. Coffee, work, small talk, familiar routines that now felt staged, like I was acting in a life I no longer fully believed in. At night, I sat across from Mark at the table and watched him talk about plans, weekend errands, future trips, the wedding ideas he liked to revisit whenever he felt particularly secure. The hardest part wasn't what I suspected. It was how normal he looked while hiding it. He laughed easily, he slept deeply, he never once asked why I'd stopped probing, stopped circling back to questions he'd always brushed aside. That told me something important. He didn't think I was curious anymore. He thought he was safe. On the third night, I opened the report. 38 pages. I didn't skim. I didn't jump ahead. I read it from the beginning, forcing myself to stay present with every line, every date, every detail. The first thing that hit me was the name. Mark hadn't just gone by a nickname or shortened version. He had legally changed his name, filed and approved, finalized years before we met. That kind of change isn't cosmetic. It's deliberate. It's the kind of thing you do when you don't want to be found by the life you left behind. I kept reading. Marriage records. My chest tightened. He hadn't been in a serious relationship, the way he'd once vaguely described his past. He had been married. 3 years. The dates lined up cleanly, indisputable. I thought back to one of our earliest conversations, the night we talked about deal breakers and expectations. I remembered asking him directly if he'd ever been married. No, he'd said without hesitation. The report said otherwise. Then came the restraining order. Not something he'd filed, something filed against him. Granted, extended, documented. I stared at the dates, 2019, then 2020, and felt my pulse begin to thud in my ears. Courts don't issue restraining orders casually, and they don't extend them without cause. The petitioner's name appeared clearly. Laura, his ex-wife. Seeing her name in black and white did something the rest of the report hadn't managed to do yet. It made the situation human. This wasn't just paperwork. This was someone who'd felt unsafe enough to ask the legal system for protection. I scrolled slowly, my hands cold. Police reports were referenced, though not fully accessible. Case numbers. Incident summaries. Enough to sketch a picture without filling in every detail. This wasn't a single bad argument. This was a pattern. The financial section came last. A bankruptcy filing in 2020. Discharge the following year. A credit history that didn't match the version he'd given me when we applied for our apartment together. He'd blamed the low number on medical bills. It wasn't medical bills. It was collapse. By the time I closed the laptop, I wasn't shaking. I was calm in a way that felt almost unsettling. Mark came home later that evening like nothing had changed, kissed my cheek, asked what I wanted for dinner, complained about traffic. I watched him move through the apartment we shared, through the life we'd built, with the ease of someone who believed his version of reality was still intact. For the first time since I'd met him, I didn't see my future when I looked at him. I saw a man who had rebuilt himself carefully, name by name, city by city, without ever taking responsibility for the damage he'd left behind. I didn't confront him that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be precise. Truth has weight. If you drop it carelessly, it scatters. If you place it carefully, it lands exactly where it needs to. I needed to decide how to do that. Because once I said her name out loud, once I asked him about Laura, the marriage, the restraining order, there would be no going back. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that whatever explanation he gave next would decide everything. Friday night arrived quietly. Too quietly. Mark didn't sense anything was wrong, or if he did, he chose to ignore it. He moved through the apartment with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed a problem had been permanently shelved. He ordered takeout from our usual place, put on a show he knew I didn't care about but pretended to watch anyway. Settled beside me on the couch like this was just another night in a long line of safe, predictable evenings. I watched him. Not the version of him I'd loved, the easy laugh, the familiar gestures, but the man I'd just met on paper. The one whose history was laid out in dates and filings and legal language. The one who had looked a judge in the eye while his ex-wife asked for protection. Halfway through the episode, I reached for the remote and paused the screen. "Hey," I said. He turned, mildly surprised. "What's up?" My voice didn't shake. That felt important. "We need to talk about Laura." The effect was immediate. His body stiffened, as if the name had struck him physically. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost frightening. Not pale, but hollow. His eyes flicked toward the TV, the doorway, anywhere but me. "What?" he said. "Why are you bringing her up?" I set the remote down carefully. "Because she keeps coming up," I replied, "in places you said didn't matter." He stood, pacing now, hands running through his hair. "I told you I didn't want to talk about my past." "You told me to drop it," I said evenly. So I stopped asking, and I started verifying. He froze. "You did what?" "I ran a background check," I said. "Public records only." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then the defensiveness kicked in hard. "You had no right," he snapped. "That's a massive violation of privacy." "You lied to me," I said, "about your name, about being married, about the restraining order, about your finances, about everything that mattered." "That's not fair," he said quickly. "You don't understand the context." "Then explain it," I said. "Why did Laura file a restraining order against you?" The room went silent. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him all at once, replaced by something else. Panic, maybe, or calculation. He sat down heavily on the edge of the couch and put his head in his hands. "I didn't want you to know her name," he said finally. "I didn't want you to Google her, or me." That wasn't the question. He dragged his hands down his face. Things ended badly. She overreacted. "Courts don't grant restraining orders for overreactions," I said, "and they don't extend them without reason." He looked up then, eyes wet but sharp. "I made mistakes. I wasn't in a good place back then." "You were married," I said. He flinched. "Yes," he admitted. "I was married, and it fell apart." "You told me you'd never been married." "I knew you'd judge me," he shot back. "I knew it would change how you saw me." "I'm judging you for lying," I said, my voice steady, "not for having a past." He stood again, pacing faster now. "Laura and I were toxic together. We brought out the worst in each other." "So toxic she needed legal protection," I said. "That's not—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "I just couldn't let go. I kept trying to fix things. She saw it as harassment." "You showed up at her work," I said. "You contacted her repeatedly after she asked you not to. You violated the order." His head snapped up. "You read the police summaries." "Yes." He sank back onto the couch, breathing hard. "I'm not that person anymore," he said quietly. "I changed. I moved. I started over." "You changed your name," I said. "You didn't change the behavior." He looked at me like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. "I needed to know who I was planning to marry," I continued, "and you made that impossible without going around you." His voice broke. "I didn't want to lose you." "You lost me the moment you decided I couldn't handle the truth," I said. The silence that followed felt final. "I need time," I said, standing. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days." His head snapped up again. "You're leaving? Over something that happened years ago?" "I'm leaving because you hid it," I replied. "Because you proved you'll rewrite reality if it benefits you. And because I don't feel safe building a future with someone who needed a restraining order in his past." He didn't follow me to the bedroom this time. I packed slowly, deliberately. When I zipped my bag, my hands were steady. As I walked toward the door, he spoke once more. "You're making a mistake." I turned back. "No," I said. I finally stopped making one. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. And for the first time since I'd met Mark, I felt something unmistakable settle into my chest. Clarity. I didn't pack everything. I packed enough. Enough clothes for a few days. My laptop, chargers, the folder where I'd started quietly saving screenshots and documents because some instinct in me had already understood that memory alone wouldn't be enough. I left the rest where it was. The couch we'd argued over, the dishes we'd bought together, the life we'd assembled piece by piece while he edited the truth out of it. Mark stood in the doorway as I moved around the bedroom, his presence heavy and unsettled. "You're really doing this," he said, not quite a question. "I am." "You're blowing this up over something that's already over," he insisted. "That marriage ended years ago." I zipped my bag and finally looked at him. "It ended for you, not for the consequences." He stepped closer. "I told you what happened. I answered your questions." "You answered them when there was no other option," I said. "That's not honesty, that's damage control." His face hardened. "You violated my privacy." "You violated my ability to consent to this relationship," I replied. "You let me plan a future with someone I didn't actually know." For a moment, I thought he might try to stop me. The air in the room tightened, my shoulders instinctively squaring. Then he stepped back, running a hand through his hair like he was recalculating. "So that's it?" he asked. "You walk away?" "I walk away," I said, "because I don't feel safe building a life with someone who hides court orders and calls it the past." I passed him and went for the door. The hallway outside felt colder than it should have. The lights buzzed softly, impersonal. The elevator ride down was quiet except for the thud of my heart against my ribs. Each floor sliding past felt like distance, measured, deliberate. I drove to my friend's place without music, without checking my phone. When he opened the door, he didn't ask what happened. He took one look at my face and stepped aside. "Stay as long as you need," he said. That night, I slept in borrowed sheets and woke up disoriented but strangely calm. No dreams, no panic, just a blank, heavy rest. By morning, my phone was lit up. Messages from Mark, one after another. "I'm sorry. Please come home. We can talk this through. I'll tell you anything you want to know." I didn't respond. An hour later, the tone shifted. "If you really loved me, you wouldn't do this. Everyone has a past. You're being judgmental." Still nothing. By evening, the messages turned sharp. "If you don't come back, I'm keeping everything in the apartment. Your stuff will be on the curb by Friday. I'll tell people you abandoned me." I stared at the screen, something cold settling into place. This wasn't grief. This was leverage. And that was the moment I stopped thinking like a girlfriend and started thinking like someone disentangling herself from a liability. We weren't married, but we'd lived together long enough for things to be complicated. Shared lease, shared expenses, shared space. Emotion had to come second to logistics now. I called a lawyer. I laid everything out calmly. The lies, the restraining order, the threats. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she gave me clear, immediate instructions. Document everything. Do not move back in. Communicate in writing only. Review the lease. Make a list of everything you personally purchased. When I hung up, something shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing a plan. Over the next few days, I gathered what I needed. Screenshots, receipts, photos, a timeline. Each action made me steadier. Each step put more distance between me and the version of myself who'd trusted without verifying. Mark didn't stay quiet. He started calling mutual friends, upset and angry, telling his version of the story, saying I'd left out of nowhere and that I'd been emotionally abusive. I didn't argue. I sent screenshots. Every threat, every swing from apology to intimidation, every attempt to control the narrative once control over me was gone. "This is why I left," I wrote. I discovered he lied about a prior marriage and a restraining order against him. Since I left, he's threatened to throw out my belongings. There was a long pause. Then, I had no idea, "I'm so sorry." Not everyone apologized. Some people prefer a simpler story, a villain they don't have to question too closely. I noted who stayed silent. I remembered who didn't. A few days later, with Mark at work, I went back to the apartment with my friend in his truck. I moved fast, methodical. Took only what was mine, left the key on the counter when I was done. No note, no final message. I didn't need the last word. That night, alone in my small, quiet space, I sat on the floor with takeout and felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Peace. Not relief, not victory. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you stepped away before the damage became permanent. The quiet didn't last. It never does when someone loses control and realizes it too late. For a few days after I moved out, the messages stopped. No new numbers. No emails, no attempts to circle back with apologies or threats. I let myself believe, briefly, that Mark had finally accepted the boundary. Then the consequences of his version of the story began to surface. It didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments, missed calls that didn't get returned, conversations that felt cooler than they should have, pauses where there used to be warmth. People weren't asking questions. They were deciding. One afternoon, a mutual friend reached out with a carefully neutral tone. "I don't want to get involved," she said, "but Mark's having a really hard time. He says you blindsided him." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I asked one question. "Did he mention why I left?" There was a pause. "No," she admitted. "He just said you stopped communicating." That told me everything I needed to know. That evening, I sent one message to a small group of people I cared about enough to be direct with. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't editorialize. I wrote, "I left because I discovered Mark lied for 2 years about a prior marriage, a restraining order filed against him, and his finances. Since I left, he has threatened to dispose of my belongings and accuse me publicly. I have documentation. I'm not asking anyone to take sides. I'm asking for space." I attached screenshots, dates, messages. Then I put my phone down. The responses came in waves. Some were immediate. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Thank you for telling me." Others never came at all. I learned quickly who preferred a clean villain over an uncomfortable truth. Mark, meanwhile, escalated again. He sent a message through an unfamiliar number. "You're ruining my life." I didn't reply. Another message followed. "You're spreading lies." Still nothing. That silence seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. A few days later, a letter arrived. Formal, heavy paper. A law firm's letterhead printed neatly at the top. I opened it standing in my kitchen. He was threatening to sue me. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Invasion of privacy. Demanded damages. $15,000. I let out a short laugh, surprised by it myself. This was the last card he had. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer immediately. Her response came back within the hour. "This is intimidation," she said. "Background checks using public records are legal. He has no case." She drafted the response for me. Clear, professional, unemotional. It stated that my actions were lawful, that his claims were unfounded, and that any lawsuit would trigger discovery, where his prior marriage, restraining order, and documented harassment would become part of the public record. Then she added one more thing. A counter-demand. Reimbursement for shared expenses he'd never paid during our relationship. Rent, utilities, deposits. $9,470. We sent it, and just like that, the noise stopped. No lawsuit, no follow-up, no further threats. Silence, real silence this time. The kind that comes when someone realizes pushing any further will only expose them more. The days after the failed legal threat were quiet. No messages, no new numbers, no third-party pressure. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, relearned the rhythm of a life that didn't require monitoring someone else's mood. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a name I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. I didn't. The message was short. "Hi, Carrie. This might be strange, but I heard through mutual friends that you were involved with Mark. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say, I know what it's like. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." It took me a moment to place her. Laura, Mark's ex-wife, the woman whose name had first appeared in court documents, in filings, in legal summaries that reduced years of fear and confusion to bullet points and dates. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted distance from anything connected to that chapter. Another part, quieter, steadier, understood the value of context that comes from someone who lived through the earlier version of the same story. I replied, "Thank you, I'm open to talking." We met a few days later in a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral, public, safe. She looked normal, not bitter, not broken, just tired in the way people are after surviving something that took longer to heal from than anyone ever sees. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this," she said after we sat down. "I wish I could say you were different, that he treated you better." She didn't say it unkindly, just honestly. She told me things the report hadn't. How the lying hadn't started all at once. It had crept in gradually, disguised as privacy. How questioning him had always turned into her apologizing for asking. How the line between reassurance and control blurred so slowly she hadn't noticed until she was already isolated inside it. The restraining order wasn't about one incident, she said quietly. It was about the pattern. He wouldn't accept being told no. He always needed the last word, the last version. I thought about the messages, the threats, the legal bluff. "It sounds familiar," I said. She nodded. "That's why I reached out." There was a pause, then she added, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did he ever actually apologize?" she asked, without explaining, without qualifying it, without making it about how hard it was for him. I didn't have to think. "No." She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years. "He never does." We sat there for a while after that, not talking, not needing to. Before we stood to leave, she said one last thing, something that stayed with me long after I walked back to my car. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad you got out before marriage, before kids. That's when leaving stops being a decision and starts being a war. Driving home, I understood something fully for the first time. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was iterative. Mark didn't just lie. He didn't just avoid accountability. He repeated himself. New partner, same structure, same ending. Different woman, same damage. And the only way to break a pattern like that is to step out of it entirely. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped into the quiet. It didn't feel empty. It felt intact. After meeting Laura, the story stopped expanding. That was the first sign it was ending. There were no new revelations waiting to ambush me, no hidden files, no surprise messages clawing their way through block numbers. The chaos that had defined the last few months of my life didn't explode. It receded, slowly, predictably, like water pulling back after a storm. The lease still existed. That was the final practical tether. 4 months left. Both our names still printed neatly on the agreement. I'd offered to pay my half until it ended, or until he found someone else. Mark tried, once more, to argue that I should pay all of it, that I was the one who walked away. My lawyer responded with the lease clause highlighted. Half responsibility, no exceptions. He backed down within 2 days. That was the last direct conflict we ever had. I sent my payments on time. No notes, no commentary, just transactions, clean and impersonal. I wanted no emotional residue attached to the last thing that legally bound us together. Mark didn't reach out again. Not directly, but echoes of him did. I heard, through the quiet social channels people use when they don't want to be obvious, that he was still telling his story, still presenting himself as misunderstood, still framing my exit as cruelty rather than consequence. It didn't sting the way it would have once. I'd already grieved the version of myself who needed everyone to agree with her. Some friends drifted away completely. Others stayed. A few surprised me by showing up when I didn't expect them to. That sorting felt natural. Painful but necessary. My new apartment started to feel lived in. I hung art without asking for input, bought furniture without negotiating style, let the silence exist without rushing to fill it. There was relief in not having to manage someone else's comfort. One evening, I realized something small but telling. I hadn't checked his social media in weeks. Not out of discipline, out of disinterest. That's how you know something is actually over, not when you decide to stop caring, but when caring quietly forgets to show up. Laura and I exchanged a few messages after our meeting. Not frequently, not intensely, just the occasional check-in. Two people acknowledging shared ground without trying to build anything on top of it. She told me she was doing better now, that life felt lighter without constantly bracing for the next version of him. I understood exactly what she meant. As the lease end approached, the sense of closure sharpened. This wasn't healing in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no moments of triumph, just the steady, unglamorous work of returning to myself. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped rewriting arguments I'd never have, stopped wondering what I could have done differently, because the answer was simple. Nothing. You can't love someone into accountability. You can't trust someone into honesty. And you can't build a future with someone who survives by erasing their past. On the night the final payment cleared, I sat on my couch and let the quiet settle again. Not the tense quiet of avoidance. The earned kind. The kind that comes after you choose yourself and don't look back to check who noticed. When the lease finally ended, nothing dramatic happened. No call, no message, no last-minute attempt to reframe the ending. The payment cleared, the contract expired, and a chapter of my life closed without ceremony. I expected to feel something sharper, relief, anger, maybe even a delayed grief. Instead, there was just a quiet acknowledgement. This is done. I moved the last box out of my friend's storage unit that weekend. It wasn't much. Winter coats, old notebooks, a few things I hadn't needed right away. I carried them up the stairs to my apartment and realized I was smiling, not because of the items themselves, but because there was no emotional weight attached to them anymore. They were just things. That felt new. I heard one final update about Mark from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Not gossip, just an incidental mention, the way people reference a closed business on a street they no longer visit. He'd moved again. Different neighborhood, new job, maybe. A new circle of people who didn't know the backstory. The pattern continuing. I felt no urge to warn anyone. That surprised me at first until I understood why. I wasn't responsible for managing the future consequences of someone else's refusal to change. I had done my part by stepping away cleanly, honestly, without trying to control the narrative or punish him. That restraint mattered to me. One afternoon, Laura texted me something simple. I finalized everything this week. I'm officially free. I stared at the message for a moment, then replied, I'm glad. No exclamation point, no emotional overflow. Just truth. We didn't become friends in the traditional sense. We didn't bond over shared trauma or dissect the past endlessly. We respected each other's boundaries. That felt healthier than anything I'd known before. As weeks passed, my life filled in around the absence. Work projects I'd postponed, friendships I'd neglected, quiet mornings that belonged only to me. I noticed how much energy I'd been spending monitoring someone else's emotional temperature, and how much of it was now available for myself. Trust didn't come back all at once, but it came back selectively. I trusted my instincts again, trusted the discomfort that tells you something's wrong before your mind can articulate it, trusted that walking away isn't failure when staying would require self-betrayal. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this, the one who tried to respect silence, who believed patience would eventually be rewarded with honesty. I didn't judge her. She did the best she could with the information she had. The difference now was that I no longer confused secrecy with depth or privacy with integrity. I knew the signs, and more importantly, I trusted myself to act when they appeared. That was what remained. Not bitterness, not fear. Clarity. I didn't rebuild my life in one decisive moment. There was no dramatic pivot, no speech in the mirror where everything clicked into place. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. I started choosing differently in small ways. I asked questions again. I listened closely to the answers. And when something didn't sit right, I didn't explain it away, just to keep the peace. That was the real change. For a long time, I thought trust meant patience, that loving someone meant giving them time, space, and the benefit of the doubt until they were ready to meet you where you were. I thought respecting boundaries meant accepting silence, even when that silence carved out entire years of a person's life. I know better now. Healthy boundaries don't erase accountability. Privacy doesn't require deception, and love that depends on ignorance isn't love, it's control. Mark didn't ruin my life. That took me a while to understand. He revealed something essential instead, that ignoring discomfort doesn't make it go away. It just delays the cost. And the longer you wait, the more expensive that cost becomes. I paid mine with time and a background check. That was enough. I'm careful now, but not closed. Thoughtful, but not fearful. I don't interrogate people. I don't assume the worst. But I no longer build futures with someone who treats their past like a locked room I'm not allowed to see. Because if someone refuses to let you understand who they were, it's usually because they're counting on you not recognizing who they still are. Laura and I stopped texting eventually, not because anything went wrong, but because we'd each moved on. That felt right. Some connections are meant to help you cross a bridge, not walk beside you forever. As for Mark, he faded into the background of my life the way unresolved things often do, not with closure, but with irrelevance. And that was enough. Sometimes people ask me if I regret running that background check, if I wish I'd just trusted him and stayed out of his past. I don't. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I was put in a position where protecting myself required proof. But I don't regret choosing clarity over comfort. She told me to drop it, so I did. I dropped the questions, I dropped the excuses, and eventually I dropped him. What I kept was far more important. My instincts, my boundaries, and my future, built on truth, not omission.